Hi, this is John Bankson, author of the Keaton film location book, Silent Echoes.
This is Jeffrey Vance talking, author of Chaplin, Genius of the Cinema, Harold Lloyd Master Comedian, and with Buster Keaton's widow, the late Eleanor Keaton, Buster Keaton Remembered. Spite Marriage was Buster Keaton's second film under his contract with MGM, and his last silent feature-length motion picture. The success of Keaton's first MGM comedy, The Cameraman, vindicated the studio's methods of adhering to a carefully prepared script and a tight budget. As a result, Spite Marriage was scripted and budgeted more tightly than even The Cameraman had been. Furthermore, MGM removed what was left of Keaton's old crew. Only Ernie Orsatti and director Ed Sedgwick remained. Keaton had originally wanted to make Spite Marriage with sound, depending less on dialogue than on sound effects. MGM refused. They had long resisted talking films and were at this time hastily equipping their stages. They reserved the few sound stages they had for musicals and dramas rather than comedy films. Keaton and director Ed Sedgwick conferred with writers Lou Lipton, Richard Schayer, and Ernest Pagano in developing the script. Robert Hopkins devised the intertitles. The basic story, however, was principally the work of Keaton. The shooting script has been preserved. Upon examination, one sees that the film starts about a dozen pages into the script. A golf sequence was abandoned, perhaps cut after a preview. Otherwise, the finished film follows the script closely. Production began on November 20th and finished December 29th. The film was released April 6th, 18 months after The Jazz Singer, the motion picture sensation responsible, with its sequences of voice synchronization, for bringing the American silent cinema to an end. This is not a set at MGM's Culver City studio. This sequence was shot on location on the steps of the Natural History Museum at Exposition Park, across from the USC campus in Los Angeles. This bit of business with the tipping of the hat Keaton will repeat twice more before using it to conclude the film. Not everything in Spite Marriage was shot in continuity. This early scene was one of the last to be filmed on December 27th. Warner Brothers used a 35mm full-aperture safety duplicate negative made from the nitrate studio print of the film as the transfer element for Spite Marriage. This is the complete original theatrical version of the film, confirmed by comparing it against the original continuity script. Elmer's object of affection is Trilby Drew, played by Dorothy Sebastian. An Alabama-born former New York showgirl, her most memorable film role prior to Spite Marriage was in the MGM hit film Our Dancing Daughters with Joan Crawford.
Here's where we learn the extent of Buster's adoration for Dorothy. We discover that Buster has built a little shrine to Dorothy. Buster's grand entrance with top hat and tails reminds me of a scene from Sherlock Jr.
Elmer sitting alone in the empty theater is reminiscent of Buster alone in a church waiting for a bride in Keaton's feature film 7 Chances. This shot demonstrates Keaton's fine eye for using the full empty space to his advantage. The annoyed theater patron is character actor Sidney Jarvis.
Sidney appeared in a number of films with Harold Lloyd and Laurel and Hardy.
Lila Himes plays Ethel Norcross. She's best known for her role as Venus in Todd Browning's cult favorite Freaks. Hank Mann plays the stage manager. Mann appeared in many silent comedies. He's best known for his role as the prize fighter in Chaplin's masterpiece, City Lights. Edward Earl plays actor Lionel Benmore, a name suggesting MGM star Lionel Barrymore. The play parodied in the film is probably the 1895 Civil War melodrama The Heart of Maryland by David Belasco. Keaton's looks of love in the film were not all acting. During the production, Keaton began having an affair with Dorothy Sebastian. Although Keaton was at that time married to Natalie Talmadge, the union was an unhappy one. Keaton's screen persona was somewhat diminished at MGM with his Elmer character. In the MGM films, Keaton is not so much naive as he is dull. However, Elmer was a name Keaton must have liked. He gave it to all the St. Bernard dogs he owned, and, long after he left MGM, when he was working in short comedies, Keaton continued to use the Elmer name for his screen characters. The reason for this may in part have to do with silent films like Spite Marriage were becoming slower, even before talking films really slowed motion pictures down for a while. And there was a tendency to adopt simpler characterizations. Harold Lloyd, for example, simplified his screen characters for his early talking films.
Buster never fit in at MGM. He didn't fit the mold. One thing that they did at MGM is they wanted to assign each star their own dressing room on the studio lot. And the first thing that Buster did was hire a house across the street. And it was only after it was made known to him in no uncertain terms that you will be on the lot that Buster reluctantly moved into a dressing room on the studio lot. Buster's dressing room was located right in the center of the studio, and everyone would walk by it every day. Buster felt persecuted when he was forced to use the dressing room on the studio lot, and so, in order to show that he was sort of in the doghouse, he made a sign called Keaton's Kennel and hung it on the porch.
Here, Elmer hisses the villain. Character actor Theodore Lorch plays the Union officer. Director Ed Sedgwick began in vaudeville with a family act called The Five Sedgwicks and featured his parents and twin sisters. He had over 60 films to his credit by the time he first worked with Keaton. He directed a total of 8 Keaton feature films at MGM. The two men were very good friends. To work with Keaton during the silent days meant one had to play baseball, and Sedgwick was a great baseball fan. In fact, Sedgwick had been a crack player on the University of Texas team. It was a joke in Hollywood that when anyone applied for a job with the Keaton-Sedgwick group, the first question asked was whether they could play baseball. To get an idea of what Sedgwick was like as a director, see King Vidor's silent feature film, Show People. Vidor based the comedy director in that film, played by actor Harry Gribben, on Sedgwick. Spite Marriage was released with recorded sound of music and effects emanating from Vitaphone discs. The audio heard on this DVD was transferred from the Vitaphone discs. Keaton preferred a full orchestra as the accompaniment to his silent films. He did not care for sound effects of any kind for his comedies. As I said before, Keaton had wanted to make Spite Marriage with sound, depending less on dialogue than on sound effects. That's quite a different proposition than what he was eventually given. Indeed, Keaton did not care at all for the sound effects given to Spite Marriage. Incidentally, Keaton, according to his business partner Raymond Rohauer, also preferred sound speed of 24 frames per second as the speed of projection for his silent films. This is the speed at which Spite Marriage is presented here. Keaton liked his comedies to have a little zip to them.
There were a number of silent film stars who just didn't make the conversion to talkies. It wasn't necessarily because they had poor voices. It's just that in many respects they played characters or represented a different time that didn't play well in the Depression era. Some people speculate that Buster could have been a successful sound comedian later on. Buster's sister-in-laws, Norma and Constance Talmadge, were both big movie stars, but the type of characters they played, the roles that they played, just didn't translate well, and so both of them stopped making movies once talkies became prevalent. There's a rumor that many film stars, including Norma and Constance Talmadge, had unsuitable film voices, but for the most part that wasn't true. Again, most people were accustomed to seeing these people in silence, and hearing their voices just sort of shattered the illusion of the roles that they were playing. Buster had an interesting voice. It was low and gravelly, and to me, it did sound like he came from the Midwest. Buster's voice was well suited for playing certain types of roles, including the bungling character. But in some respects, to play a dapper millionaire, I'm not certain if his voice or accent was as well suited as it could be.
Here again is the hat-tipping bit of business. Visual jokes can fall flat with repetition. Keaton will do a slight variation of the hat bit again in a moment. Keaton plays a stage door Johnny in Spite Marriage, but in real life he was anything but. He was in fact born barely off stage in Pickaway, Kansas. His parents were, at that time, medicine show performers. Keaton would often explain that he was born with a show, a child of the theater from birth. Elmer avoids being crushed by stepping through the doorframe of this flat, a variation of a famous scene in his feature film Steamboat Bill Jr. The name Bosco on the back of the flats suggests a parody of Belasco, evidence that the film is indeed parodying David Belasco's play, as I mentioned earlier. Spite Marriage was remade as I Doed It, starring Red Skelton and directed by Vincent Minnelli. Keaton worked on the remake in the capacity of a gag writer and comedy consultant. Keaton had joined the writing staff at MGM after his fall from grace from the studio, and worked there as a consultant on and off until 1950. As a result, the Keaton touch can be seen in many MGM comedies of the period. To be reduced to a gag writer may appear degrading. After all, Keaton was one of the greatest film artists of the 20th century. However, Keaton never saw himself as a great artist and was embarrassed by and mistrustful of those who did. Keaton saw himself as a vaudevillian who had been fortunate enough in silent films to have had the opportunity to make pictures the way he wanted them. But he was now an actor for hire, and he made himself available for virtually anything. When asked, Keaton was also willing to contribute gag ideas and direction.
Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, and Buster Keaton were all in uniquely different situations. Charlie Chaplin owned his own studio and could lavish as much time and money on his films as he wanted. City Lights and Modern Times were both essentially silent films. Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, and Buster Keaton all had very famous faces, but Chaplin wore makeup and covered his face with a mustache. Harold, on the other hand, was somewhat unrecognizable without his trademark glasses. But Buster's character, his icon, his image, was his face, and he never wore makeup to cover it up.
The gentleman next to Keaton is probably the film's makeup artist. Surviving behind-the-scenes still photographs on the nitrate negatives I examined for Buster Keaton Remembered depict this man in street clothes applying Keaton's makeup.
Buster has a tough time getting his makeup right. While Buster often bungled things for a laugh, it's impossible to imagine Charlie Chaplin playing this type of gag. Buster grew up on the vaudeville stage. His father was a knockabout comedian, and his mother sang and played the saxophone. Buster's father actually stitched a suitcase handle to Buster's costume so that he could pick Buster up and swing him around like a prop.
Keaton was 33 years old at the time of Spite Marriage. He clearly had the body of an athlete. He was not a tall man. He stood just 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed about 140 pounds during this period of his life. Just to demonstrate that I spent far too much time with Keaton's widow, Eleanor, I can also impart that Keaton wore a 6 7/8 size hat and a 7.5 size shoe. If you look carefully enough, you can see that a tip of Keaton's right index finger is missing. He had lost the tip of his right index finger in a childhood accident. At the age of 3, he stuck his finger in a clothes wringer and crushed it. The local doctor was summoned, and they amputated Buster's finger at the first joint. Elmer having trouble with the spirit gum is reminiscent of a similar predicament with a pot of glue in Keaton's two-reel comedy, The Haunted House.
This scene reminds me of a scene from Buster's short film, The Haunted House, where he plays a bank teller. Buster spills a pot of glue on a pile of cash and ends up with dollar bills stuck all over his face, hands, and pants. One interesting thing about this scene is that Buster never wore makeup in any of his films, so in a sense, it's almost shocking to see his iconic face covered with all this fake hair and fur.
Spite Marriage contains some wonderful backstage gags. Other Keaton films with backstage gags include Backstage, a two-reeler he made with Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, along with The Playhouse and Daydreams. Keaton and Sedgwick added much to this sequence on the set, not indicated in the shooting script. Here Elmer hisses at the villain again.
I love the way Buster sneers at the Union officer. Buster rarely showed emotion when making films, so anytime that you can see his teeth, it's really kind of a rare occurrence.
William Bechtel, a Max Sennett veteran, plays Nussbaum, Trilby's manager. Keaton was born with the name Joseph Frank Keaton, as 5 earlier generations of firstborn sons before him had been called Joseph Keaton. Keaton always said it was Harry Houdini, the great escape artist, who gave him his nickname Buster after seeing the 2-year-old Keaton take a fall down a flight of stairs unhurt. "That's sure a buster," Houdini proclaimed. "That's a good name for him," responded Keaton's father, Joe. There are several variations to this story, but Keaton was consistent in his version. Whether it was Houdini or some other family friend who gave Buster the name he would use for the rest of his life, one thing appears to be certain. Keaton was the first to use it as a nickname. Previously, Buster was only commonly used as vaudeville slang for a stage fall. The name Buster Keaton even predates R.F. Ottkalt's Buster Brown comic strip. As uninspired as some of these comedy bits may appear, knocking over scenery during a stage performance was pretty old hat. They leap to life with an audience. As wonderful as the advent of home video truly is, one must remember that comedy, particularly silent comedies, need an audience. It's only when one sees these films on a big screen with a large crowd, the way they were originally designed and timed, that they truly come to life. Keaton's professional debut was at the age of 5 when his parents' vaudeville act, The Two Keatons, became The Three Keatons. In time, it would be considered the roughest vaudeville act in the history of the American stage. The success of the act was based on Little Buster's ability to take spectacular pratfalls unscathed. He had learned stage acrobatics and comic falls by watching his father and other vaudeville acts. Keaton always maintained that because he started performing at an early age, his body control was completely instinctual. He also quickly developed an instinct for comic invention, technique, timing of comedy routines, and what made people laugh, which would serve him well when he started to make films.
Buster always used his ineptitude as a source for jokes in his films, but it was one thing to be clumsy at the beginning of the film and then show your triumph at the end, as opposed to playing a bungler through the entire film. Unfortunately, in Buster's later films for MGM, he was just cast as a fool, and in some films he even lost the girl at the end of the movie. When Buster made his own independent films, he always won the girl at the end of the movie, usually because of his daring courage and ingenuity. The biggest problem for Buster when he moved to MGM was that he lost more and more control over his films. Buster was always the main creative control behind his films, and he was accustomed to being allowed to improvise on the spot. At MGM, they had a rigid system, and they insisted that he work from a script. And while he was able to fight the system for a while, making The Cameraman, and to some degree in Spite Marriage, by the time the talkies came in, they needed to stick to the script, and that was just not the way Buster worked. It became more and more frustrating for him, and it led to part of his problems with MGM.
Note how Elmer manages to catch his hat when he stumbles. That's not as easy as it may look.
Buster performed little feats like this all the time, and I'm certain this gesture was planned.
In addition to Spite Marriage, Dorothy Sebastian appears, albeit briefly, in Keaton's Free and Easy, as well as in his two-reel comedy Alley Oop. Trilby Drew is a handful, like other Keaton heroines were handfuls, but she isn't so very nice. Nevertheless, Dorothy Sebastian's conniving and contemptuous Trilby Drew is one of Keaton's most well-rounded and satisfying female characters.
The heroines in Buster's earlier films were usually just disinterested. They were aware of Buster, but just didn't pay any attention to him. Dorothy plays a different type of character. She's aware of Buster and schemes and ways to use him to her advantage. Dorothy's role in Spite Marriage is different from the roles women usually played in Buster's film. Buster usually used the girl as just a prop or some convenient way to find a gag. Here, Dorothy actually has her own personality and stands up to Buster and uses him to her advantage to get back at her boyfriend. Her role in this film is not as passive as a typical Keaton heroine.
This insert shot is not Keaton's hand, but that of a hand double. Keaton used a stand-in for insert shots involving his right hand to conceal the fact that he had lost the tip of his right index finger in a childhood accident, as I indicated earlier. frequent use of the dissolve in Spite Marriage is very effective. In the silent era, dissolves, fades, and the like were all created inside the camera on the one piece of film. Reggie Lanning, cinematographer of Spite Marriage, had been the second camera operator on The Cameraman, working with Elgin Leslie, one of Keaton's favorite cameramen. Lanning continued to work as a cinematographer in films and later television well into the 1950s. One of his better-known films as cinematographer is the John Wayne vehicle Sands of Iwo Jima, directed by Alan Dwan. This was the period of Prohibition. United States federal law prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors in America. The Café La Bohème is presumably a speakeasy.
Buster's first feature film, 3 Ages, contains a similar nightclub scene. Only there the patrons warily hide their booze from the police. No one in this scene appears to be worried at all about the police. In his autobiography, Buster never acknowledged his affair with Dorothy Sebastian. He simply stated that most, but not all, of the extramarital rumors about him were not true. Buster also wrote that he'd like to see the healthy, normal man in his spot at MGM who could resist more temptation than he did. When his affair with Dorothy began, Buster was married to Natalie Talmadge. When Buster and Natalie divorced, she changed the names of their children from Keaton to Talmadge.
Keaton and Dorothy Sebastian's affair lasted 2 years. Keaton enjoyed her ability to have a good time. They both shared a liking for practical jokes, bridge, dancing, and drinking.
Buster continued to date Dorothy off and on until Buster met Eleanor Norris, an MGM dancer who would become Buster's third wife. Buster was an expert bridge player, and Eleanor and other studio folk would visit Buster's house to learn how to play. Eleanor wrote that Buster felt compelled to set Dorothy up with another man before he could ask Eleanor out. Although Buster was more than twice Eleanor's age, Eleanor and Buster remained married for 26 years until his death, and Eleanor never remarried. She single-handedly championed his name and is greatly responsible for reestablishing Buster's place in film history.
Robert Hopkins created the text of the film's intertitles, categorizing them by noises. "What kind of title do you want?" he'd inquire. "One like this?" And then he would make a noise he thought suggested the kind of title being considered. In this manner, he probably dictated all the Spite Marriage titles to writer Richard Schayer. This sequence was filmed on December 6th and 7th on a set constructed on Stage 8 at MGM with nearly 100 extras.
You have to be impressed by what a tremendously good sport Dorothy must have been. As you'll see, not only here, but throughout the film, she was manhandled like a sack of potatoes, but she always came up smiling. You'll notice that notwithstanding her embarrassing behavior, Buster is always very attentive to her and is watching out for her. Spite Marriage was filmed on a tight production schedule between November 20th and December 29th. Most of Spite Marriage was filmed on the studio lot, as a great many of the scenes were filmed indoors. Buster loved to film outside on locations, but the Spite Marriage script didn't call for many scenes to be shot outside.
The putting the bride to bed sequence is the most celebrated moment in Spite Marriage. For Keaton, Spite Marriage was a series of battles with producer Larry Weingarten. The most vehement was the putting the bride to bed routine. Weingarten was the brother-in-law of Irving Thalberg, the vice president and head of production at MGM. Thalberg saw to it that it was the producer, and not the star or director, who was in charge of an MGM production. When Weingarten saw the dailies of this sequence, he told the editor, Frank Sullivan, that he need not bother breaking the footage down. Weingarten considered the sequence low comedy, and he didn't like it. "I don't like this type of thing in my pictures," was his explanation. Keaton fought hard to save it. He won that battle, and he was vindicated. It's the best thing in the film, and Keaton would reuse it in various forms in the film's Parlor, Bedroom, and Bath, Taming of the Snood, Nothing But Pleasure, and I Do'd It, as well as on stage in Three Men on a Horse, at the Cirque Medrano, and in his British music hall routine. Director William Wyler used it with Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn in the film Roman Holiday. Weingarten went on to produce such comedies as A Day at the Races with the Marx Brothers and the Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn films Adam's Rib and Pat and Mike. In the routine, Dorothy Sebastian appears to be merely a breathing prop. However effortless as it may appear on screen, it was carefully choreographed, and Sebastian is doing a lot to help Keaton move the sequence along, even though she may appear to be lifeless. In order to work out his comedy sequences, Keaton would place coins on a sheet of paper. The coins represented characters, and the sheet of paper suggested the set on which Keaton played out a sequence. An original nitrate still photograph negative, dated October 2nd, reproduced in Buster Keaton Remembered, shows Keaton doing just this during pre-production of Spite Marriage. Keaton also worked with music. He timed out his comic situations to popular tunes on the radio. As Keaton said, a good comedy sketch can often take more mathematics than a school book. This scene shows MGM guiding Keaton's character toward a sympathy he had always refused to ask for in his own independently made feature films. The toy dog with the teardrop eye, as the critic Walter Kerr pointed out, becomes Buster's alter ego, for a time at least, in the film.
Lionel taunts Buster in front of the Hotel Carmel, standing on the corner of 2nd and Broadway in Santa Monica. The hotel opened in 1928 and is still in business.
Elmer punching Lionel Benmore here is done quite seriously and is somewhat astonishing to the audiences with which I've watched the film.
Buster races up 2nd Street from Broadway in Santa Monica, past the Pacific Hotel boarding house, the Anderson Automobile Top Store, and the Cinneberg Auto Garage, now all replaced by a modern parking structure. The car dealer billboard told me that these scenes were filmed in Santa Monica rather than in Hollywood.
John Byron plays Scarzy, the rum runner.
Buster actually makes a reference to the movie's synchronized soundtrack when he complains that the taxi is too loud.
This New York street set was also used in The Cameraman.
The taxi is now driving northeast up Pier A Street in Wilmington, past the Coast Fishing Company, located on Fry's Avenue. This setting is located by slip number 5 of Los Angeles Harbor. The car now rounds the corner from Pier A Street onto Water Street along the Catalina Steamship Terminal building.
This is not Buster Keaton, but rather stuntman Bobby Rose. Keaton was forbidden by MGM to do such dangerous stunts himself. This was one of only 2 times Keaton used a stuntman to double him in a silent feature film. The other occasion was for his film College. In College, Buster had to pole vault to a second-story window. Keaton hired Lee Barnes, who had won the gold medal for pole vaulting at the Olympics, to perform the stunt for him. The crates in the background read Hennessy's Cognac. MGM had released the previous year, at great cost, a John Gilbert drama about bootleggers called 12 Miles Out. Using the same props reduced the Spite Marriage budget. The revenue cutter title refers to the Coast Guard cutters. It was the Coast Guard who conducted the unpopular rum war at sea, as it was called during Prohibition. Keaton always covered himself with goose grease when he performed water scenes for his films. He explained that it kept the heat in the body and prevented him from feeling cold. Since this scene was filmed in December, and at night, note the spotlight, the water was undoubtedly very cold. Incidentally, Keaton always tried to work in at least one scene involving water when he made his silent comedies. He and his crew had a superstitious belief that having Buster immersed in water ensured a successful film. Of the 5-week production, 2 weeks, from December 10th to December 22nd, were on the boat in waters off Long Beach. This was a fast shoot, even for Keaton. As a filmmaker, Keaton tended to work faster than Chaplin as well as Harold Lloyd. Just as a point of reference, a major feature film today is in production from 12 to 14 weeks. These shots of Elmer varnishing the mast, I believe, were filmed from a swinging crane.
This wonderful point of view shot is one of the most effective shots I can remember. Look at the rushing water below and the depth of the deck. Nowadays, this type of shot would be filmed in the studio against a blue screen, losing some intangible sense of reality in the process.
Falling off the bench was a risky stunt, the type of risky stunt the MGM front office requested that Keaton not perform. Keaton, however, loved doing these sort of things. Moreover, it would have been difficult to find a stuntman who could perform them the way Keaton wanted them performed. Keaton so loved doing pratfalls and stunts of all kinds that he even stunted for other actors in other MGM films. Just one example is a stunt he did for actor Lou Cody in the film Baby Cyclone at MGM, a film made around the same time as Spite Marriage.
4 of Buster's films dealt directly with boats: the short films The Boat and The Love Nest, which was a boat, and the feature films The Navigator, which was about an ocean liner, and Steamboat Bill Jr., which was about a paddle wheeler. Some of the boats Buster used include a ferry boat, an amusement park boat, a dugout canoe, a racing scull, a battleship, and a submarine. Buster even used odd things as boats, including a bass drum, a bathtub, a floating horse, a floating car with a convertible roof as a sail, and even himself in a pressurized sea diving suit. Given his love of boats and water, Buster must have enjoyed filming Spite Marriage very much.
The yacht used in the film was reportedly 135 feet in length. Frank Dugas, assistant cameraman on Spite Marriage, maintained that the boat was owned by Keaton, but this has not been confirmed. Dugas also recalled that on one day, the film director, Clarence Brown, kindly flew over their boat and dropped film attached to a parachute, which luckily fell onto the boat. The Spite Marriage Company was out on the yacht longer than expected, and Brown thoughtfully made a much-needed film drop. Elmer and Trilby, alone and adrift on the high seas, is the same sort of comic duet Keaton created in The Navigator. To his credit, Keaton does not recycle gags from the earlier film. Journalist Helen Ludlam visited the yacht at Long Beach and provided the only location report I know of for the film. According to Ludlam, during the first 2 days out at sea, there was a bad storm and everyone had been seasick. However, not everything was so rough on the yacht. They had their own chef aboard by the name of Pep Page, who made elaborate meals for the cast and crew. A typical breakfast included grapefruit, shredded wheat, grape nuts, oatmeal, pancakes, ham and eggs, cornbread, and clam chowder. Dorothy Sebastian, who wore summer clothes for the boat scenes, was bitterly cold and miserable for the entire shoot aboard the yacht. All she could manage at most meals was a piece of toast. Seamen and grips had lashed the yacht to a tug, which carried 4 cameras and wind machines to make the cold shoot even colder. The unit mostly filmed when the sky was overcast, to simulate the storm. The cast and crew appreciated the irony of the situation. Most film companies had the opposite problem. Ed Sedgwick spent his time waiting for overcast conditions with musician Norman McNeil, working on the composition of songs. Sedgwick had already composed the music and lyrics of 20 popular songs, such as You Told Me to Go and Just Remember. McNeil played on the accordion by ear what Sedgwick sang between scenes until they had it just right. Elmer is no longer an incompetent boob, but a capable man. This gradual transformation is underscored by his assuming the captain's hat. This isn't much of a squall, is it? The company had trouble finding storm clouds. When a storm did strike earlier on, the boat pitched and everyone, including Keaton, became too seasick to work. Evidently, they missed their only opportunity. This is the Buster Keaton in the old manner, resourceful but always subject to the whims of fate.
Every comedy needs a dramatic story, and it's not unusual for the comedian to have to confront a villain. Buster was unusual in that he often would use elemental forces, such as waterfalls or cyclones, to provide the dramatic pull to the story.
Elmer and Trilby caught in the sail was mainly improvised. Such moments would be written into the shooting script with the notation, "Other gags will of course suggest themselves on set." The rum runner's boat is named the Huntress. This situation of being overtaken by rum runners is similar to the Navigator. In the Navigator, Buster and the heroine are on a ship overtaken by cannibals. Keaton fought against this complicated gangster plot of the second half of Spite Marriage, preferring to eliminate it in favor of a simpler story, but to no avail. Spite Marriage was commercially successful. It made nearly as much as The Cameraman at the domestic box office. Although it does not enjoy the same critical reputation as The Cameraman, Keaton's Spite Marriage is still treasured as the last of his films to display the intrinsic Keaton style of comedy. Keaton's style of comedy is, of course, visual. Buster was a creature of the silent film. Hallmarks of Keaton's style of comedy include mechanical precision and outguessing his audience. By that I mean the audience expects one result and the comedian gives them another. His best work also has no traces of sentimentality.
Buster performs a nifty little trick with the bottle and tray. True to his vaudeville roots, Buster was an accomplished juggler. Buster could hold an empty wine bottle on the palm of his hand, flip it into the air, and catch the inside of the neck on his extended finger.
This silly sequence could not have worked as well in a talking film. It is the type of situation perfect for silent comedy.
I love this scene with Dorothy flirting for the gangsters. It's so silly, yet somehow it really works. Dorothy's fun-loving spirit was one of the charms that attracted Buster to her. I love this scene too. Buster searches for a weapon to attack the cook. Then he thoughtfully hands him a rolling pin. It's a very clever yet simple visual gag. Here, Buster uses one of the oldest silent comedy bits ever known, secretly hiding between two idiots and taking turns hitting them to fool them into thinking the other person is starting a fight.
Elmer's fight with Scarzy is nearly as brutal as the fight sequence in Keaton's Battling Butler. As with the scene in Battling Butler, Keaton's physical mastery with his fists is clearly evident, but the scene has very few laughs to it. Just as with the earlier bit when Elmer punches Lionel Belmore, the fight scene here seems out of key with the rest of the film. Harold Lloyd's masterpiece, The Kid Brother, has a few things in common with this Keaton sequence. The Lloyd film has Harold in a brutal fight with the villain on an abandoned ship, but Keaton's sequence lacks the conviction of Harold Lloyd's film.
Buster must have gotten a lot of bruises filming this scene.
This single shot, a long shot, follows Keaton, carried by the current, from one end of the yacht to the other. Keaton made certain this moment was photographed in this manner so that the authenticity of the image is clearly apparent and is never fabricated through editing.
When Buster was filming Our Hospitality, one stunt went wrong and he was swept away down the Truckee River and almost drowned, but the cameramen were instructed to keep rolling. They never stopped filming until Buster gave them the cue to stop.
Elmer's transformation from zero to hero is complete, and he reclaims the captain's hat.
Buster appears to have blood on his mouth, the first time I can recall Buster ever wearing blood makeup in a movie.
This title is a reference to the Civil War melodrama play of the first part of the film. This scene was filmed on location at Long Beach. This scene was filmed on location in Santa Monica. With the hat-tipping bit, Keaton ends this film and the last of the great Keaton comedies. Yet as long as the films of Buster Keaton endure and new generations continue to embrace his genius, the great Keaton, once and forever silent, shall always be a part of us. In conclusion, I wish to acknowledge the film historian Kevin Brownlow, whose own Keaton research he has kindly shared with me and from which this commentary has greatly benefited, as well as James Karen and Eleanor Keaton, from whom I learnt so much. This is Jeffrey Vance.
This is John Bankson.
Thank you for listening.